The stage directions, she looks attentive, as they all do. He holds them for a moment before continuing are important, because they indicate his pompous or vain desire for attention. Now, before we start the next section of Burling's speech, it is important to note that the audience in 1946 would know how wrong he was, highlighting his complete lack of knowledge. He says, "I'm delighted about this engagement, and I hope it won't be too long before you're married. And I want to say this, there's a good deal of silly talk about these days, but, and I speak as a hard-headed businessman who has to take risks and knows what he's on about, I say you can ignore all this silly pessimistic talk. When you marry, you'll be marrying at a very good time. Yes, a very good time. And soon, it'll be an even better time. Last month, just because the miners came out on strike, there's a lot of wild talk about possible labour trouble in the near future. Don't worry, we've passed the worst of it. We employers at last are coming together to see that our interests and the interests of capital are properly protected, and we're all in for a time of steadily increasing prosperity." Here, note the use of the word silly is important because it emphasises his own stupidity. He describes himself as a hard-headed businessman, and the alliteration here emphasises his cruel nature, which becomes important later on when we find out about Daisy or Eva. There's also dramatic irony here, as the audience is aware of the fact that Burling couldn't be more wrong. His claim, "there's a lot of wild talk about possible labour trouble," further demeans and undermines him as a respectable character, because it's not wild talk and does actually happen. His use of imperative in "don't worry" is important because it again emphasises his controlling nature. The properly protected, the alliteration there, emphasises his confident tone. He is adamant that he is right. He is right. We can see from this speech that he is a capitalist with no social responsibility whatsoever. His capitalist self-serving mindset is shown here, as is his selfishness. Gerald, we can see, agrees with him. "I believe you're right, sir." It's important that he sides with Burling because it casts him as a traditionalist and hints that he will later side with Burling too. Eric then questions, "What about war?" and we find out that despite Eric's many flaws, he is actually quite well informed. Then Burling says, "Glad you mentioned it, Eric. I'm coming to that. Just because the Kaiser makes a speech or two, or a few German officers have too much to drink and begin talking nonsense, you'll hear some people say that war's inevitable. And to that I say, fiddlesticks. The Germans don't want war. Nobody wants war, except some half-civilized folks in the Balkans. And why? There's too much at stake these days, everything to lose and nothing to gain by war." Here we can see that Burling is presented as foolish yet again. The "glad you mentioned it, Eric" trivialises the notion and casts him as adamant that he is right. We can see through "to that I say fiddlesticks" further use of dramatic irony through topical allusion, as a 1946 audience would have known how wrong he truly was. We can also see through the juxtaposition of everything to lose and nothing to gain by war, his stupidity. Eric then says, "Yes, I know, but still," and we can see that he is cut off. He's shot down. "Just let me finish, Eric. You've a lot to learn yet." Here we can see that he is patronising, and we see the contrast or the theme of the old versus young and both of their mindsets emerging. He says, "I say there isn't a chance of war," and again we can see his stubborn nature and his lack of knowledge. This foreshadows his later stubbornness when the inspector arrives. Note his talk of aeroplanes that will be able to go anywhere, and look at the way the automobile is making headway, bigger and faster all the time. And then ships. Why, a friend of mine went over this new liner last week, the Titanic. She sails next week, 46,800 tons. 46,800 tons. New York in 5 days, and every luxury, and unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. Now, here we can see this inaccurate viewpoint. 3 decades would see 2 world wars, the Titanic sinking, a depression, social unrest, unemployment, and 4 strikes. We can also see that he has great faith in technology and how technology solves all of our problems, shown through the comparatives bigger and faster all the time. The repetition emphasises his adamant nature that again, he is right. And there's the dramatic irony of the unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. If we skip down to, by that time, you'll be living in a world that'll have forgotten all these capital versus labour agitations and all these silly little war scares. Again, he this belittles this possibility, and we can see his capitalist mindset. He has a complete lack of understanding about war and what's going on around him. This is further shown through the alliteration of peace and prosperity and rapid progress everywhere, except of course in Russia, which will always be behindhand, naturally.